It's the late 18th century, and as a wealthy wool merchant, you're on your way home after selling your goods to the woolen mill that's just opened up in Bridgend, South Wales. You've been trundling along the winding and bumpy country road in your coach for a while now, when you reach a river blocking your way forward. There is a bridge across, but there's no way that your coach is going to fit over it. So, left with no other choice, you unload from the coach and make your way across the ford by foot. By this late hour in the day, the light is fading fast when in front of you, just on the other side of the river, you see the glowing warmth of an inn. Now seems as good a time as any to stop for the night before it gets too dark, and so you decide to turn in here for the night, before catching another coach for the rest of your trip in the morning. But little did you know, as soon as you set foot over that threshold, you'll never see the light of day again. Because according to the legend, the inn that was nestled right next to the ancient dipping bridge in Merthyr Mawr was the site of one of Wales's most prolific serial killers. While nowadays the inn is long gone, you should still be careful where you stop around the dipping bridge late at night, as the area is said to still be frequented by the malevolent spirit of this ancient landlord, looking for his next mark. So first, we've got to chat about this bridge itself, because that has a super interesting story. It is an ancient bridge crossing the River Ogmore in Merthyr Mawr in Glamorgan, South Wales. And the bridge looks to have been first mentioned in records in the mid-16th century by a guy called John Leland, who was an antiquarian. Someone who's kind of like a historian, but more into artifacts and antiques and things. And so it got its name, the Dipping Bridge, because there are two holes in the parapet, the walls of the bridge. And these holes aren't actually meant to be there, they were by design, because farmers would herd their sheep onto the bridge, the far end would be blocked off, and the sheep would have nowhere to go other than out of these holes into the water of the River Ogmore below. They'd then have a nice little dip in the water to wash their fleece, and then be herded back out of the river ready for shearing in a day or two. Don't want a poopy fleece, no one wants that. And the river in this area, it's reasonably shallow, it's not very fast flowing or anything like that, so the sheep didn't wash away or anything. That wouldn't be the most ideal. But the bridge itself, it was part of one of the main roads in the area way back in the day for people going either one way to West Wales or the other to London. There was the issue though in that the bridge at Merthyr Mawr, the Dipping Bridge, it was too narrow for anything more than probably one of those small open carts pulled by one horse or a mule or something. Not the most ideal for wealthier travellers with big old stagecoaches and whatnot. But what would happen in this situation if a traveller coming from the west reached the river and they weren't going to be able to cross? They had to alight from their stagecoach and get across the river in that shallower bit, basically a ford, the shallowest part, before then being able to catch another stagecoach at Ewenny, the next village along, before carrying on to London. So this natural break in a lot of travellers' journeys, this presented potentially quite a lucrative business opportunity. And so there was an inn conveniently situated near to the Dipping Bridge. And there is a little bit of discussion online as to where this inn actually sat, but from a map that we have from 1799, it looks like the inn, called the New Inn, imaginatively, sat not too far from the bridge on the west side of the river. And so during that time, the 18th century, that main road would have been super busy with travellers, farmers and packmen, not to be confused with Pac-Man, wrong century. Packmen would travel around selling their items specifically in that area, things like sheep, fleeces, wool, all of that sort of thing. And this would make for excellent passing trade for the New Inn, always plenty of people going past, deciding to stop over for a beverage or a bed for the night to carry on their journey in the morning. And that only increased when Bridgend, the nearest town, started growing their industry and opening its first woolen mill in 1791. And so on the surface, everything's peachy, right? Apparently the inn was a little rough and ready, but then again, travelling in the 1700s wasn't the safest of things to do, so in all, rough and ready is doable, right? To the unsuspecting traveller who happened upon the New Inn, nothing seemed amiss. But here's where we get into the legend, because the landlord of the inn in the late 18th century was a man known only as Cap Coch, which translates to red cap. This was apparently because he was always seen wearing a red cap, similar to the Phrygian cap, which was worn as this symbol of liberty during the French Revolution. Something that Cap Coch was apparently very passionate about. He was very much in support of it. Under his tenure, the New Inn became a bit of a den for smugglers and highwaymen, something that Cap Coch was very much aware of, and in actual fact, he was the ringleader for this band of not at all merry men. Travellers who were on the road alone would run the risk of running into these men, where they would likely be beaten to within an inch of their life and then have all of their belongings stolen. But that was only a side business compared to the main operation at the inn, because it got brutal in there. So because this was such a main road and the new inn was the perfect stopping off place, they would often get wealthy travellers looking for a bed for the night. Cap Coch or one of his gang would spot the mark, make sure he was travelling alone, and start rubbing their hands together in a not at all ominous way. They would proceed to attend to this traveller's every need, really turning it all the way up on the hospitality, especially making sure that his pewter mug was never empty. That was the important bit. Once the traveller was suitably sloshed and ready to turn in for the night, he would be shown to his private bedroom, where he would be left to effectively pass out for the night. Only a short while later, Cap Coch would enter this unsuspecting victim's room and stab the passed out traveller to death. The gang would then take everything of value that the traveller had been carrying and unceremoniously dump the body off the dipping bridge into the River Ogmore, where the water would carry away their dirty little secret. And for a while, that method worked beautifully. Everyone knew that travel in those days was dangerous, there was all types of wrong-uns about. Alongside that, there weren't easy ways to keep in contact with each other. Some people did just vanish off the face of the earth, and no one would even know that they had gone missing. Some versions of the story state that they would target pilgrims on their way west to the Shrine of David, which they may have valuables on them, things that they were going to give as offerings and whatnot. And also, I mean, it's not beyond the realms of imagination to speculate that some of these pilgrims, on reaching their destination, would decide to stay and devote their life to the service. And so again, their absence wouldn't really raise much suspicion. However, as Cap Coch and his gang were picking off their wealthiest and most vulnerable patrons and selling off their valuables without too much difficulty in town, downstream from the new inn, their bodies were starting to pile up. Initially, as the River Ogmore flows into the Bristol Channel, and the Bristol Channel is a super busy shipping area, it was just assumed that these bodies were sailors that had just washed up in the estuary. Nonetheless, some of the locals around Merthyr Mawr were getting a little suspicious that these bodies washing up always seemed to coincide with patrons from the new inn never being seen again. But they didn't really have anything to go on, no evidence, people move on all the time without saying goodbye, and so it was just suspicion. Not long after that speculation had started circling around the community though, the bodies stopped washing up altogether. Didn't really get to the bottom of it, but 0 dead bodies is a win, a step in the right direction, so we'll take that. From here though, the story kind of has 2 different endings depending on what source you read. The first says that Cap Coch continued to run the inn and his crimes went completely undetected until he died peacefully in his bed at the age of 90 in 1820. Never faced justice for what he and his gang did. However, the other ending to Cap Coch goes that he was actually hanged, but not for the murders. He was found guilty of stealing a single sheep, and so he was executed on Stalling Down near Cowbridge, which is about 7 miles away from the dipping bridge. So whichever way, that was the end of Cap Coch. The inn would also eventually meet its demise, as in the 19th century a new bridge was built elsewhere, and the dipping bridge was no longer the main route anymore. And so with that, obviously people aren't going to use the old route anymore, too much faffing around getting over the river at Merthyr Mawr, so the passing trade dropped off a cliff at the new inn. Eventually, the inn became more valuable for the materials it was made out of rather than the business itself, so apparently around 1900, 80 years after Cap Coch had passed away, the new inn was torn down and the stones were used to construct buildings in Bridgend, which was continuing to boom with industry and being a market town. However, apparently, as the inn was being demolished, they found a cave hidden away in what would have been the kitchens. On investigation of this mysterious cave that no one had known about, they found basically treasure. It was a huge cache of valuables, absolutely nothing you would expect to find in an abandoned, rundown old building. So obviously this got the alarm bells ringing. The people who discovered it were a bit suspicious, so the police were called who suspected foul play. These all seemed to be stolen possessions, things you wouldn't really be able to turn around and sell very easily. And so they decided to investigate a little more. They started digging up the inn's garden, and it didn't take long before the whole case took a turn. They quickly came across shallow graves, most with 2, 3 or even 4 skeletons dumped inside, and everywhere they dug, they found more graves. They started to expand the area where they were digging into the woods around the inn, the fields nearby. Apparently again, they were still coming across more shallow graves. Turns out that when the bodies stopped washing up, the killer hadn't stopped or moved away, he'd just changed his MO. Cap Coch, not forgetting he's a pub landlord, he hears every everything in the local area. He'd heard the whispers, the rumours, heard what people had been saying. And so when people had started getting suspicious that there was a killer on the loose, he'd stopped dumping the victims' bodies in the river and started burying them instead. A move which would prove to be very beneficial, as the true extent of his vicious crimes were only discovered long after he had died, whether by natural causes or being executed for something else entirely. And so that was the legend of Cap Coch and the infamous New Inn. It's not clear how many victims he claimed. There's no number assigned to how many bodies washed up or how many graves were found or anything like that. To be honest, what we know about the story as it stands, there are quite a lot of questions left behind. One of the big ones that people can't seem to agree on is where specifically the New Inn sat. Obviously, it's long gone now, but based on that 1799 map, we can see what looks to be a building on the west bank of the river to the left of the road as you cross the bridge. However, a lot of people say no, it can't be there's no foundations left over, literally not a trace that there was ever a building there, and it just seems too small to put what would have been a full-on coaching inn with room for stabling and all that sort of thing too. Others claim that the inn was located nearer to the gatehouse of Merthyr Mawr House, an estate that sits on the eastern side of the river, literally like a 5-minute walk from the dipping bridge. But it's reasonable to assume that it was somewhere in this vicinity, as the road is now called New Inn Road, and the dipping bridge also has the name New Inn Bridge, so there's that. But aside from where the inn may or may not have stood, getting into the gritty details of the story, could it have actually happened? Did it really happen? First of all, Cap Coch himself. Just having a nickname doesn't really give us a lot to go on, does it? So because of that, there's no way to know whether he did die peacefully in his bed at the age of 90. But being hanged for sheep stealing, surely, if that was the truth and that's really what happened, there would be a record of that, right? What was really interesting to find is that there were only ever 6 men executed at Stalling Down, which is where it claimed Cap Coch had a date with a hangman. Because ordinarily, the Great Sessions, which were basically Wales's equivalent of the Assizes in England, where a judge would travel around to the different towns to hear all of the court cases that he needed to. They would usually have been held in Cardiff, but from 1768 to 1788 they were held in Cowbridge, leading to the condemned being hanged on Stalling Down. Of the 6 men executed here, 4 of them were for murder. John Thomas, a cobbler, was hanged in 1786 on multiple counts of theft, but not of sheep. Then Hopkin Owen, a labourer, he was executed for horse theft, again, not stealing a single sheep. Apparently there was a record from Cardiff jail saying that an unnamed innkeeper was imprisoned there for pig droving, but I couldn't find that record, and we don't even know if it resulted in the man's execution. Casting the net a bit wider though, giving the benefit of the doubt, I looked at the records in the National Library of Wales, and no one was hanged for stealing sheep from the parish of Merthyr Mawr. There was only one man hanged for sheep stealing in the entirety of Glamorgan, and that was John Hugh, but he was a butcher. There was one innkeeper from Glamorgan that I could find who was put on trial for stealing a sheep in 1820. His name was David Smith, but he was 28 years old, which is a little young to fit the timeline here. Plus, the verdict was no true bill, so they weren't even sure that a crime had been committed, much less that he was put to death for it. But of course, Cap Coch is just a nickname. Aside from that, we don't know a great deal more about him. He could have lied to the authorities booking him about who he was, where he was from, anything like that. But then, aside from the mystery around this guy, we've got to look at the actual crime. Well, yeah, records from the late 18th century weren't as robust as later years, so we might not have heard about the disappearances and things, but those human remains were apparently found in the very late 19th century, maybe even early 20th century, when the inn was torn down. And we don't appear to have a single shred of solid evidence that these bodies were ever found. No newspaper articles, police reports, anything. There is a local historian and author, Loveluck-Edwards, who has written about this legend in his book, which, by the way, fantastic book. Highly recommend that you pick it up. But he claimed that in the 1980s they were doing flood management work to the river in that area, when all of a sudden they had to stop what they were doing and get the police involved. Because apparently they had found human remains, which, if true, that would be pretty wild, but I couldn't find any news sources or anything like that to back it up. But just on the number of alleged victims, by the sounds of it, Cap Coch and his cronies were operating for an extended period of time. The amount of graves in this story make it seem like the bodies body count was high, surely at least one of those travellers would have someone who would be wondering where they were. Especially if we're talking wealthy merchants, they're going to be more missable when they don't show up. People are going to notice. But aside from all of that, the legend of Cap Coch and his brutal crimes has endured. It's still a well-known tale connected to the Dipping Bridge. So much so that local author Alun Morgan actually wrote a novel based on the story called The Inn of Fear. Look at me remembering to bring books into the room when I record. It's like vintage Don't Scare Claire back when she was organised. That's a lie, I've never been organised. And some people out there are convinced that some of the treasure, the bounty of stolen items that couldn't be sold, is still out there. Apparently the local farmers have had to kick metal detectorists off their field because they're still looking for it. But the Dipping Bridge itself, it's still in use, it's just wide enough for one vehicle to squeeze through, and it's now actually a listed structure because of its age. They don't take sheep for a dip anymore. The last time was in 1962, which was actually televised. And nowadays, in the summer months, you'll see people in the river hanging out at the banks, some fish in there as well. Although I did see in the local Facebook groups that in the years previous they had pulled out something ridiculous like 17 shopping trolleys. So maybe you want to wade into the river rather than jumping off the bridge. The area does seem to have a real problem with flooding. Although the bridge was closed for something like 5 months while they did some big flood management project in 2024, unfortunately one man did lose his life at the Dipping Bridge in 2017 when his car was swept away by floodwater, which is really tragic. He was on his way to pick up his wife, who had just done a night shift as a cancer nurse, which is just absolutely horrendous. And it's such a stark reminder that this nice little idyllic looking site still does hold real life dangers, most often when you're least expecting it. And just like it may have done all those years ago for all those unsuspecting travellers, some of whom people are convinced are still hanging around the area. Some people claim to have a strange feeling when they walk over the bridge now, and others have said that they heard screaming in the dead of night when no one else is around. Which, I mean, if the legend is true, and there were masses of shallow graves in the area, who's to say they discovered them all? Maybe there are still victims of Cap Coch still out there. But the bridge is also supposed to be haunted by the man himself, with the stories saying that people have felt the sensation of being pushed while they're on the bridge. Although I couldn't find any other witness accounts or anything saying how they know it's him, it just seems to be the stories associated with it. But while the historical evidence may be lacking on Cap Coch and his violent side business, that hasn't stopped this story from being passed down through the years. And with the ghost story now attached to the Dipping Bridge, well, that may just mean that you want to make sure that your car doors are locked when you're crossing the bridge late at night. But as always, I want to know your thoughts. It was a bit of a different one for me today. I usually choose a location based on the ghost story, but this story was all about the folklore, and I'm not mad about that, to be honest. I've actually got to shout out Beardo Gets Scared for bringing this one to me. When he suggested it and gave me a quick rundown of the story, I was hooked. I needed to know more. As to what I think of the story though, I think it is a fantastic legend and definitely gives me Ostrich Inn vibes. You know, when we chatted about the murderous husband and wife, who would again get their guests drunk and then kill them, rather imaginatively with the Sweeney Todd style bed into the cauldron of boiling water. I have to say, Cap Coch probably had an easier time with the murders, a lot less moving parts than the Wallace and Gromit contraption that was allegedly at the Ostrich Inn. However, without seeing in reality a shred of evidence that any of this actually occurred, it is just that to me, a legend. But then again, where do these stories start? Usually if you go back far enough and you uncover the right record or you dig in the right places, you can uncover the single tiny grain of truth where this may have all started from. And who knows, maybe Cap Coch was actually a farmer who lived near the Dipping Bridge back in the 16th century and would pick off trespassers on his land before dumping them in the river, moving on to eventually burying them in his field. Or maybe Cap Coch was his nickname because he had red hair and it wasn't because of the French Revolution, opening the story up to be pretty much any time frame really. Or maybe the whole thing was just a cautionary tale told to solo travellers to keep their wits about them on those long, lonely country roads. Maybe so. Because then by extension of that, we're calling into question the ghost stories too. If we're doubting the folklore, then how can we believe the ghosts are who the stories say they are? Not to mention the fact that all of the reports that I saw were things that can be easily dismissed. The screaming could just be local wildlife. Strange feelings while crossing a bridge. Some people just get a bit anxious crossing a bridge over water. That's totally normal. It would also be really interesting if someone came forward saying that they'd had an experience that they believed was paranormal in the area, rather than just the story goes kind of stuff that I came across. Basically, what I really want is someone to say that hand on heart they saw a huge shadowy figure in a red cap come running towards them. Now that would be compelling, right? That would make me sit up and think that there could be something to this legend. But those are just my thoughts. I know that the Dipping Bridge has been a location where a few people have gone out to investigate over the years, so maybe one day we'll hear of more to this story. Maybe. But if you enjoyed this video, please let me know by leaving it a little like. It was a bit of a shorter one this evening, but I hope you still enjoyed it. I'll be back next week with a bit of a fun one. I'm looking forward to bringing the story to you. It's not my usual sort of thing, again, but there will be even more ghosts, don't you worry. So if you're not already, you might like to think about subscribing so you don't miss out. It is going to be good. But anyway, that is all from me today. Go get a drink of water. Cap Coch can't hurt you if you're well hydrated and not passed out drunk. But I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. I've just had a text from Paul from Ghosts on Trent right as I'm recording this. Paul, I promise the voiceover will be with you when you need it. I just need to get through my own recording and then I will record the voiceover. It's coming, I promise.